What do you want me to do here? Do you want me to criticize the film? Do you want me to criticize the filmmaker? Like, do we talk about this movie just as an artifact sitting on the shelf of a museum of our times as they unfold? Or do we deal with the fact that Ali Tabrizi is somebody I have known for years? I know his story both as it is revealed by this film and as it is concealed by this film, and that I am myself in myriad impalpable emotional ways linked to the creation of this movie. And moreover, my 500 most regular viewers on this channel, not all of you, but about 500 of you, you all also remember Ali Tabrizi from YouTube before he deleted every trace of himself and his channel. You remember the strange prequel to this film that was the SEASPIRACY YouTube video that ultimately indirectly ended up inspiring and leading to the creation of this film now that's available on Netflix. So what am I supposed to address here? When I tell you that this film begins with autobiographical reflections on the motivations of the filmmaker, many of you, at least 500 of you, will right away say, oh, wow, okay, so he's going to talk about the fact that he used to hang out with Durian Ryder and Freely, right? That he used to be a vegan YouTuber amongst vegan YouTubers before he got into this idea of making a documentary film about, the fishing industry. Nope, not at all. This opens with a sort of parallel universe version of the life of Ali Tabrizi, in which he was a big fan of Jacques Cousteau and was walking down the beach cleaning up garbage, and in which he wasn't vegan at all. He hadn't even thought about veganism until the shocking end of this film, where there's a plot twist and he realizes the key that unlocks the door, the solution to the riddle, the big mystery. It's veganism. This is about as strange as if I asked you guys for money on Kickstarter so I could make a documentary film about Black American rappers who are vegan. Like, let's just say I did that. It's actually not that implausible. I could go down to Detroit and start interviewing guys. So I want to look at African American hip hop and then the vegan subculture overlapping with that, emerging from. I'm going to do a documentary about that. So you guys all donate $50 and I take my $200 camera and make this film. And you guys know me from YouTube. You know my interest. Like, I'm someone who grew up knowing hip hop, and then after a certain point in my life, I knew about veganism, and then I brought these interests together. And instead, this film begins with me saying, like, what is veganism? I'd never even heard of this thing before. But then one day, when I was innocently listening to rap music, expecting vivid imagery of gangsters robbing banks and drug dealers disputing who is going to have sex with that hoe next, to my surprise, I learned that many of the vocalists were vegan. I decided to investigate, and step by step, as my journey took me to scenic Detroit, Michigan, I discovered. Dude, am I going to pretend that the shocking conclusion of this film is that me interviewing these guys convinces me to become vegan, that it wasn't some kind of prior vested interest I had, or that it wasn't the thesis for the film or the raison d'etre for the film before I made it? Yeah. Ali Tabrizi's SEASPIRACY takes the very, very strange storytelling approach of completely fictionalizing the narrator, fictionalizing the genesis of the film itself, the raison d'etre for the film, and then including all of that information within the film when it really doesn't need to be there. Speaking of a parallel universe, if I were in the position of editing this film before it was shown to a film festival audience, let's say we have a documentary film festival in a small town in Michigan, wherever, it doesn't matter. What I would do to improve the film, to make it more appealing to that audience, is probably chop off the first 25%. I mean, roughly. I did not count the number of minutes. But something like the first 25% of this film, I feel is terrible. And then you get into kind of the main middle portion of the film, which is, as you should expect, fact, fact, fact. It's just an avalanche of interesting facts about how horrible the fishing industry is, the whaling industry is, the ecological consequences. That's well presented. As I said in my critique of Cowspiracy, in some ways the spiritual antecedent to this film, and I'll come back to that because this film in many ways awkwardly imitates the formula of Cowspiracy, an earlier documentary film, to frankly an embarrassing extent. But I said about that earlier film also, if you already know this stuff, it's not going to be that interesting for you. I watched this with my girlfriend, and there were several points where she was like, oh, that's interesting, never heard about it before. And I was like, yeah, well, I've heard exactly that before. I've read articles about that already 20 years ago. So there's nothing wrong with that, except when there's something wrong with it, which is at several points I was saying, it seems as though the filmmakers never made up their minds as to what extent they were presenting this to an audience of children and to what extent they were trying to reach out to sophisticated adults. So to give you an example, the issue of floating plastic in the ocean comes up several times. If you want to present that to an audience of sophisticated adults, you could broach the issue by saying, starting in the year 2000, this became mainstream news. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It was on the cover of National Geographic. There was this mainstream advertising campaign with this famous movie star that drew attention to the issue. You could broach the issue as something the audience is likely to have already heard of or already ignored. Or you could even present different controversial views on it. Well, some people accept it was a big deal and some people dismiss it. Whatever you want to do. And this film instead, while being completely inappropriate for children, not being a children's documentary in any way whatsoever, it talks about all these things. The majority of the issues introduced in the movie are introduced like, did you have any idea that there's floating plastic in the ocean? I just heard about this. I was shocked. I was surprised when I, for the first time, heard there's floating plastic in the ocean. And, even if that were sincere, and the film suffers because of the insincerity of the narrator, as already hinted at, but if that were sincere, like if you were someone who just never heard this stuff before, you're hearing about it for the first time, and you want to share your sense of shock and incredulity, you have to think as a filmmaker about the position that puts the audience in. Because almost anyone who is going to click to watch this film, is going to somehow pay to see this film under whatever circumstances, there's someone who already has a pretty significant degree of ecological literacy, right? They are someone who has at least seen the stories on the cover of National Geographic and Time magazine. They have been exposed to. So, yeah, I feel that the filmmakers chose to put themselves at a really strange disadvantage in this way. Now, after that first 25% of the film, which I feel is the weakest part, and I would urge you, like, if you're watching this and you feel impatient, skip ahead, because there are some really good, enjoyable parts of the film later on. But you might not enjoy the first part. You might stop watching. You might give up on it entirely. Whereas we get a lot of first-person reflections from a very insincere, fictionalized version of the narrator in that first 25%, then in the rest of the film, there are no explanations for the very strange situations we see the filmmaker living through. Like, why didn't you have a Japanese translator when you were in Japan? Why didn't you have a Thai translator, someone speaking Thai for you? Why didn't you conduct these interviews in other circumstances? If you wanted to get that interview with that corporate head, why didn't you wear a suit and tie and present yourself in like there are a lot of really obvious questions that come up in watching the remainder of the film. And you have this incongruous contrast between the carefully crafted first-person story that opens the film and the absence of any such narrative in the remainder. Now, look, my original inspiration with Ali Tabrizi was actually a YouTube video he made on a totally unrelated topic where he talked on camera about masturbation. He got a question from the audience. He was sitting here with another guy, another vegan activist at the time, who's now, he ended up in a nut house, literally. He ended up in a mental asylum. He's a whole other story. But these two guys, they're on camera doing a video together, and the question from the audience is about watching porn and masturbation. And you know, this was just a few split seconds long, but I remember it as if it were an hour. They get this question, and they kind of look at each other, and they look down at the floor, and they look at the camera, and, you know, they just waffle their way out of it. There's just really no answer at all. And I remember sitting there watching that and thinking, that is the exact opposite of everything I want to do on YouTube. That is the exact opposite of everything I want to do as a filmmaker, as a writer, as an author, as a creative person. Like, no, if you are getting on camera to talk about pornography and masturbation, you commit and you go all the way. You give it 110%. You give it all the authenticity you have got to give, right? And there's got to be intensity, and there's got to be feeling, and there's got to be personal integrity, and there's got to be a sense of personal risk too, right? Like, you know, I don't know. So Ali Tabrizi, again, in that particular sense, he got this question about masturbation porn. He just backed off. He just wasn't going to deal with it. Now, you know, I had my own conflict with him where it was like, look, dude, this is what's happening with Durian Ryder, and we're going to court, and it was a big conflict. He was on Durian Ryder's side. A lot of you guys in my audience remember that. He just backed off of that, you could say. I didn't hear from him for a couple years as a result. But, you know, when I first got involved in YouTube, I had to think about it a lot. And there is risk, and there is sorrow, and there is suffering, and there is a personal cost. I mean, in some ways, my life would be easier if I just never mentioned that I'm getting divorced. If I just never mentioned that I have a daughter and that I'm struggling to have custody and visitation rights for my daughter. Like, in so many ways, socially and in terms of my employability, if I never mentioned any of my political views on any controversial subject, like, I could have come on YouTube and I could have done fundraising to open my own vegan petting zoo, animal sanctuary, and people would have supported. There was a way to play this game to win. And I had to decide early on, no, what I'm committed to is my own sense of personal integrity. And that's going to produce content that has certain advantages and disadvantages, shall we say, right? I'm going to live with the consequences of my personal integrity. And that includes being honest about my own ignorance, being honest about the things I don't know, being honest about my own motivations, and then also being honest about whatever it is I have to share with you. So as someone who is in some ways an insider to the creation of this film, it's very strange to be able to say, look, it's not just that the narrative presented in this film feels phony. I happen to be in a position to say, as a matter of fact, that it is phony. And that does a great disservice to what would otherwise be scientifically, ecologically, politically, and ethically fairly interesting content.